Story 1. Reginald Brooks was born on March 20th, 1945. He grew up in the United States and was African American. He had at least one brother named Tyrone. Tyrone later developed a mental illness called schizophrenia. This family history of mental illness would become important later. Reginald grew up, went to school, and became an adult. He married a woman named Beverly. Together they had 3 sons. Their first son was Reginald Brooks Jr., born around 1965. Their second son was Vaughn, born around 1967. Their third son was Niarchos, born around 1971. The family lived together in a 2-family house in East Cleveland, Ohio. They lived in the lower part of the house, and another family lived upstairs. For many years, Reginald Brooks worked and supported his family. He held a job and brought in money to pay for the house, food, and other needs. During the early 1970s, he also took college-level psychology courses. This meant he learned about how the mind works. This fact would later be brought up by the prosecution because they believed he used his knowledge to fake mental illness. In 1976, something changed. Reginald Brooks quit his job. He stopped working and stayed at home. After that, his wife Beverly became the only person in the family who earned money. She went to work every day to support her husband and 3 sons. This caused tension in the household because Reginald was not contributing financially. Around the same time, Reginald's behavior started to become strange. He began to think that his co-workers from his old job were trying to poison him. This was a paranoid thought. He also started to isolate himself. He stayed at home most of the time and stopped visiting friends and family members. He became suspicious of his wife, Beverly, too. He accused her of trying to poison his food. He thought his phone was being tapped. His unusual actions became more noticeable. At one point, he mutilated a child's doll. He cut a hole in the doll's chest and hung the doll by its neck from a chandelier in the house. He also destroyed his record albums. He mutilated a wall ornament of a cat by scratching out the cat's eyes. He believed in voodoo and the occult. He thought that magic spells could be placed on people. He also tore the telephone off the wall during one of his angry moments. Reginald Brooks was sometimes physically aggressive with his wife. He struck Beverly with his hands on more than one occasion. This was not the first time he had been violent in the marriage, but it added to the growing fear and unhappiness in the home. As time went on, his paranoia became more focused on his own family. He began to accuse his wife Beverly of having an incestuous relationship with their oldest son, Reginald Jr. This accusation was false, but it showed how disturbed his thinking had become. He also became jealous of Reginald Jr.'s athletic abilities. His oldest son played sports and earned trophies. Reginald Brooks refused to allow his son to display those trophies in the house. He did not want to see his son's achievements. There was also a strange incident involving money and property. Reginald Jr. had earned money by working at a car wash. He used that money to buy a watch. One day, the watch disappeared. Later, the family discovered that Reginald Brooks had taken the watch and pawned it. This meant he sold it to a pawn shop for cash. This action made his son feel betrayed and added to the tension in the household. The tension in the Brooks family grew worse over time. There was a serious physical fight on January 31st, 1982. On that day, Reginald Brooks confronted his son Vaughn about his schoolwork. Vaughn did not respond the way his father wanted. Reginald became angry and struck Vaughn. Beverly tried to step in and stop the fight, but Reginald pushed her out of the way. Then Reginald Jr. entered the room to help his mother and brother. A struggle broke out. The 2 sons, Reginald Jr. and Vaughn, were able to physically subdue their father. This meant they held him down and stopped him from hurting anyone else. After the fight was over and the boys let him go, Reginald Brooks looked at his oldest son and said, "You're dead." This was a direct threat. It showed that he was holding a grudge against his own child. By this time, the marriage was falling apart. Beverly Brooks had decided that she wanted a divorce. She filed for divorce in the fall of 1981. The legal process took some time. Finally, on March 4, 1982, Reginald Brooks was officially served with the divorce papers. This meant a court officer handed him the documents that said his wife was ending their marriage. When Beverly told him about the papers, he said he was going to burn them. He also told her that if he did not know better, he would be afraid of himself. This statement suggested he was aware that his anger was becoming dangerous. Beverly continued to go to work every day to support the family. In the week leading up to Saturday, March 6, 1982, her employer told her that she would have to work on that Saturday. She informed her husband about this. So Reginald Brooks knew that on the morning of March 6th, his wife would be out of the house for several hours. He would be left alone in the house with his 3 sons. That was the situation in the Brooks household. The family was full of conflict. Reginald had quit his job years earlier. He had become paranoid, violent, and delusional. He had threatened his eldest son. He had been served with divorce papers just 2 days earlier. His wife was going to be at work on that Saturday morning. He would be home with the boys. The tension had been building for years, and everything was about to reach a breaking point. On February 24, 1982, Reginald Brooks took a cash advance of $140 from his credit card. He did this quietly. He did not tell his wife or anyone else in the family about this money. This was the first step in a plan he had been forming in his mind. The very next day, February 25, 1982, Reginald Brooks traveled across town to a city called North Olmsted. He went there specifically to buy a gun. He walked into a firearms store and purchased a .38 caliber special revolver. He also bought ammunition for the gun. The total cost was $125. He paid with cash from the credit card advance. When he filled out the federal gun registration form, he did not tell the truth. He was asked if he had ever been arrested. He had been arrested before for grand theft, but he checked the box that said he had no arrest record. He lied so that the store would sell him the gun. The store owner later remembered him because he had come from a different part of town just to buy that specific weapon. After buying the gun, Reginald Brooks brought it home and hid it. He did not tell his wife or his sons about the gun. He kept it secret. He waited for the right moment to use it. On March 4, 1982, 2 days after he bought the gun, Reginald Brooks was officially served with the divorce papers. His wife Beverly had filed for divorce months earlier, but now the legal documents were delivered to him by a court officer. He told Beverly that he was going to burn the papers. He also said that if he did not know better, he would be afraid of himself. That statement showed that he knew his anger was out of control, but he did not seek help. He did not tell anyone about the gun. On the evening of March 5, 1982, Beverly Brooks informed her husband that she had to work the next morning. Her employer had asked her to come in on Saturday, March 6th. She would leave the house early and not return until the afternoon. Reginald Brooks heard this information and understood what it meant. He would be alone in the house with his 3 sons for several hours. There would be no adult around to stop him. On the morning of March 6, 1982, Beverly Brooks woke up and got ready for work. She left the house between 7:15 and 7:30 a.m. Her 3 sons were still asleep in their beds. Reginald Brooks was awake and moving around the house. Beverly went to work, not knowing what was about to happen. Shortly after his wife left, Reginald Brooks walked the family dog. A neighbor named James Scoble saw him outside walking the dog at approximately 7:30 a.m. The neighbor confirmed later that the man he saw was definitely Reginald Brooks. This act of walking the dog made things look normal. It was as if nothing unusual was going to happen. But this was part of the plan. At about 8 a.m., a woman named Vicky Hayes was in her bedroom upstairs. She lived in the upper part of the 2-family house, directly above the bedroom where the three Brooks boys slept. She heard a loud sound come from downstairs. The sound was like a gunshot. Then she heard another loud sound. Then another. She heard a total of 3 loud sounds. After that, she heard music playing from a stereo. The stereo was turned up very loudly, and it played for the rest of the day. The loud music was meant to cover the sounds of the gunshots so that the neighbors would not hear them and come to investigate. What had happened was this. Reginald Brooks had taken the .38 caliber revolver that he bought 9 days earlier. He walked into the bedroom where his 3 sons were sleeping. The boys were not awake. They did not see him coming. He walked up to Niarchos, who was 11 years old. Niarchos was sleeping in his bed with the covers pulled up over his head. Reginald Brooks placed the gun near the covers and shot his youngest son in the head. The bullet went through the covers and killed Niarchos instantly. Then Reginald Brooks walked over to the bunk beds where his other 2 sons were sleeping. Reginald Jr. was 17 years old. Vaughn was 15 years old. They were both still asleep. Reginald Brooks shot each of them in the head while they lay in their beds. He killed both of his older sons with single gunshots to the head. There was no struggle. The boys did not wake up in time to defend themselves. After he had shot all 3 of his sons, Reginald Brooks left them lying in their beds with their wounds. He did not call for help. He did not try to revive them. Instead, he went to the stereo and turned up the volume even more. He wanted to make sure that if anyone heard anything, they would think it was just loud music. Then Reginald Brooks went to his bedroom and packed a suitcase. He put his personal items inside. He also put the murder weapon inside the suitcase. He put the gun in a box, along with extra ammunition. He made sure the gun was fully loaded. He also packed his high school diploma and his birth certificate. He was planning to leave Cleveland and never come back. He took the suitcase and left the house. He walked or traveled to the Continental Trailways bus station in Cleveland. At the bus station, he bought a ticket to Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas was far away from Cleveland. He purchased the ticket with cash. The bus was scheduled to depart from Cleveland at approximately 10:40 or 10:55 a.m. that same morning. He boarded the bus and sat down. He was now on his way across the country. While Reginald Brooks was on the bus, another event happened back at the house. A girl named Vonda Jackson called the Brooks home sometime after 9 a.m. She was a friend of Reginald Jr. and wanted to speak with him. Reginald Brooks answered the phone. Vonda asked if she could talk to Reginald Jr. Reginald Brooks replied, "I am afraid not." He did not explain why. He just said no. Vonda thought this was strange. She called the house 3 more times out of curiosity. She called until 11 a.m., but nobody answered the phone on those later calls. The calls went unanswered because Reginald Brooks had already left the house by then. Back at the house, the 3 boys remained in their beds. The stereo was still playing loudly. Hours passed. No one came to check on the boys because everyone thought they were at home with their father. Beverly Brooks finished her work shift and returned home between 3:30 and 4 p.m. that same afternoon. She walked into the house. She noticed that the stereo was playing very loudly. She also noticed that her husband was not home. She called out for her sons, but did not get a response. She walked into the bedroom where the boys slept. She saw that all 3 were still in their beds. This was unusual because they would normally be awake by that time in the afternoon. She looked at Niarchos. She saw blood on his bed covers. She thought at first that he might have had a nosebleed. She pulled back the covers to check on him. She saw that Niarchos had been shot in the head. She then looked over at the bunk beds where Reginald Jr. and Vaughn were sleeping. She saw that they too had been shot in the head. All 3 of her sons were dead. Beverly Brooks screamed. She ran out of the house in terror. She did not touch anything. She did not move the bodies. She went outside and contacted the police to report what she had found. By the time Beverly discovered the bodies, her husband Reginald Brooks was already on a bus heading west. He had a suitcase with the murder weapon inside. He had his personal documents. He was traveling far away from Cleveland. He had killed his 3 sons and left them in their beds, and now he was trying to escape to another state. The police were notified. Officers arrived at the house. They saw the bodies of the 3 boys. They saw that the stereo was still playing. They saw that there was no sign of forced entry or a struggle. The house had not been ransacked. It appeared that the shooter was someone the boys knew and trusted. The police quickly realized that the father, Reginald Brooks, was missing. They began to look for him. At that time, the police did not yet know exactly where Reginald Brooks had gone. They had not yet tracked him down. They had not yet arrested him. But they knew he was the prime suspect because he was not at the house and his wife had just served him with divorce papers. The investigation was just beginning, and the search for Reginald Brooks had started. After Beverly Brooks discovered the bodies of her 3 sons and called the police, the investigation began immediately. Officers arrived at the house and examined the scene. They saw that the 3 boys had been shot in the head while sleeping in their beds. They found no signs of a break-in or a struggle. The stereo was still playing loudly. The officers also noticed that Reginald Brooks was not in the house. They asked Beverly where her husband was, and she did not know. He had disappeared. The police began to search for Reginald Brooks. They checked his credit card records. They discovered that he had used his credit card to purchase a bus ticket on the morning of the murders. The ticket was for a Continental Trailways bus that was traveling from Cleveland to Las Vegas, Nevada. The police now knew where he was heading. They contacted law enforcement agencies along the bus route and asked them to watch for him. On March 8, 1982, 2 days after the murders, Reginald Brooks was on a bus that was passing through Beaver City, Utah. The police in Utah had been notified about him. They stopped the bus and took him into custody. He was arrested without any resistance. The police read him his rights, and he said he understood them. He then refused to talk about the crimes. He would not answer any questions about what had happened in Cleveland. When the police asked Reginald Brooks about his luggage, he told them he only had 1 small maroon bag. He said that was all the luggage he was carrying. The officers took that bag and then searched his wallet. Inside his wallet, they found a baggage claim check. This check was for a second piece of luggage that had been checked onto the bus. Reginald Brooks had not told them about this second suitcase. The police followed up on the baggage claim check. They contacted the bus company and asked them to look for a suitcase that had originated in Cleveland and had been sent to Las Vegas. On March 19, 1982, a bus driver found a red suitcase at the Las Vegas bus station. The suitcase had come from Cleveland. The police retrieved it. When they opened the suitcase, they found personal items belonging to Reginald Brooks. They also found a black box. Inside the box was a .38 caliber special revolver. The gun was fully loaded with 6 live rounds of ammunition. There was also a box of extra ammunition. Beverly Brooks had told the police that one of her suitcases was missing from the house after the murders. She identified the red suitcase as hers. She also gave the police the combination to the lock on the suitcase. The police had her permission to open it. They also obtained a search warrant to make sure everything was legal. When they opened the suitcase in front of Reginald Brooks, he denied that the suitcase was his. He said he did not know anything about it. The police examined the gun and the ammunition for fingerprints. They found fingerprints on the gun box and on 2 of the cartridges. They compared those fingerprints to Reginald Brooks's fingerprints. The prints matched exactly. They also did ballistics testing on the gun. They recovered 2 bullets from the victims' bodies that were not too damaged to test. The tests showed that both bullets had been fired from the same .38 caliber revolver that was found in the suitcase. A third bullet was too damaged to make an absolute match, but it had the same general characteristics. The police also tested the sleeve of the coat that Reginald Brooks had been wearing. They found gunpowder residue on the right sleeve. This showed that he had recently fired a gun. The police also traced the gun back to the store where it was purchased. The firearms dealer identified Reginald Brooks as the man who had bought the gun on February 25, 1982. The dealer remembered him because he had come from a different part of town to buy the gun. The dealer also provided the registration form that Brooks had filled out. On that form, Brooks had lied about his criminal history. He had been arrested for grand theft before, but he checked the box that said he had no arrests. This showed that he had tried to hide his identity when buying the weapon. On March 10, 1982, just 4 days after the murders, a grand jury in Ohio indicted Reginald Brooks on 3 counts of aggravated murder. Each count was for the death of one of his sons. The indictment also included death penalty specifications. This meant that the prosecution was seeking the death sentence. Reginald Brooks was brought back to Ohio to stand trial. Before the trial started, the court held a hearing to determine if he was competent to stand trial. This was a legal process to decide if he could understand the charges against him and help his lawyers defend him. A court-appointed psychiatrist named Dr. Aaron Bilowitz examined Brooks on several occasions. Dr. Bilowitz testified that Brooks suffered from schizophrenia, but he believed Brooks was still competent to stand trial. He said Brooks understood the charges and was able to work with his attorneys. The defense had another report from a clinical psychologist named Dr. Sandra McPherson. Her report was not conclusive about incompetence, but it raised questions. The defense lawyers chose not to present her report at the competency hearing. The court found Reginald Brooks competent to stand trial. Brooks waived his right to a jury trial. This meant he chose to have his case decided by a panel of 3 judges instead of a jury. The trial began on September 19, 1983. During the guilt phase, Brooks refused to let his lawyers give opening statements or closing arguments. He also refused to let them call witnesses or cross-examine some of the prosecution's witnesses. The prosecutors presented all the evidence. They showed that Brooks had bought the gun 9 days before the murders. They showed that he had lied on the gun registration form. They showed that he was alone with his sons on the morning of the murders. They showed that he had turned up the stereo to cover the sounds of the gunshots. They showed that he had packed the murder weapon and fled the state. The evidence was very strong. On September 23, 1983, the 3-judge panel found Reginald Brooks guilty of all 3 counts of aggravated murder. The next phase of the trial was the penalty phase. This was the part where the judges had to decide whether to sentence Brooks to death or to life in prison. The defense presented witnesses to show that Brooks was mentally ill. Dr. Stanley Althoff, a psychologist, testified that Brooks suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He said this illness could impair a person's judgment and reduce their control. He said it likely contributed to the crime. Dr. Kurt Bertskinger, a psychiatrist, testified that Brooks had psychogenic amnesia. This meant he could not consciously recall the events of the murders because his mind was blocking out the trauma. Because of this amnesia, Bertskinger could not give an opinion on Brooks's state of mind at the exact time of the killings. One of Brooks's attorneys also testified that Brooks had refused to testify at both phases of the trial. He also refused to take a sodium amytal test, which is a drug sometimes used to help people remember repressed memories. The prosecution presented its own witnesses. They called a police officer named James Huey and Beverly Brooks to testify. They wanted to show that Brooks had taken college-level psychology courses in the early 1970s. They also showed that psychology books were found in the Brooks house after the murders. The prosecution argued that Brooks used his knowledge of psychology to fake amnesia and pretend to be incompetent. The prosecution also called Dr. Bilowitz again. He testified that Brooks was legally sane at the time of the murders. He agreed that Brooks had schizophrenia, but he said Brooks still had the ability to understand that killing was wrong. He also said Brooks had the ability to control his actions. He pointed to all the planning that Brooks had done, such as buying the gun in advance, turning up the stereo, and fleeing the state. He said these actions showed Brooks knew what he was doing and knew it was wrong. On November 30th, 1983, the three-judge panel announced their decision. They sentenced Reginald Brooks to death for each of the three murders. In their written opinion, they acknowledged that Brooks suffered from schizophrenia. They also acknowledged that his family relationship had deteriorated and that he was under stress from the divorce. But they concluded that his mental illness did not prevent him from understanding that killing his sons was wrong. They said he had the ability to stop himself, but he chose not to. They also rejected his claim of psychogenic amnesia. They said his memory problems were only about things that made him look guilty. He remembered things that were not incriminating. They concluded that his denials were lies, not genuine memory loss. They found that the aggravating circumstances of killing 3 children outweighed any mitigating factors. The death sentence was imposed. Reginald Brooks appealed his conviction and death sentence. The first appeal went to the Ohio Court of Appeals. That court affirmed the conviction and sentence in August 1985. Brooks then appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld the death sentence in 1986. They reviewed all the evidence and agreed that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating factors. They also said the death penalty was not excessive compared to other similar cases. Brooks then appealed to the United States Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court refused to hear his case in 1987. Over the years, Brooks filed other legal challenges. He filed a petition for post-conviction relief in state court in 1987. He argued that his lawyers had not adequately investigated his mental health history. He submitted affidavits from family members and experts. The state trial court rejected his claims in 1997. The Ohio Court of Appeals affirmed that decision in 1999. The Ohio Supreme Court declined to review it again. Brooks also filed a federal habeas corpus petition in 2002. This was a request to a federal court to review his case. He again argued that his lawyers were ineffective during the penalty phase. He presented new information about his strange behavior, such as his belief in voodoo, his accusations of incest, and his refusal to let his son display trophies. The federal district court rejected his claims. He appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. In 2008, the Sixth Circuit affirmed the denial of his habeas petition. The court found that the new evidence was not strong enough to change the outcome. The court said the sentencing judges already knew Brooks had schizophrenia, and the additional details would not have made a difference. The court also noted that Brooks's actions before and after the murders showed he knew what he was doing and was trying to escape. In the years that followed, Brooks continued to file appeals and requests for clemency. His lawyers argued that his mental illness made him incompetent to be executed. They said he was a paranoid schizophrenic and could not understand why he was being put to death. The Ohio Parole Board reviewed his request for clemency. The board unanimously recommended against clemency. They said Brooks had never admitted to the murders and had offered nonsensical theories about who committed them. They found no reason to reduce his sentence. Governor John Kasich also reviewed the case and denied clemency. On November 15, 2011, Reginald Brooks was scheduled to be executed at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville, Ohio. The execution was originally set for 10 a.m., but there were delays. His lawyers filed last-minute appeals, including to the U.S. Supreme Court. They argued that his mental illness made him incompetent. All of the appeals were rejected. The execution was rescheduled for the afternoon. Before the execution, Brooks was allowed to have a last meal. He ordered a large meal that included lasagna, chili cheese fries, garlic bread, Moose Tracks ice cream, chocolate cake, caramel candy, beef jerky, cashews, almonds, and root beer. He spent the night before visiting with his brother and his attorneys. He slept from about 11 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. on the day of the execution. He did not make any phone calls or write any letters. At approximately 1:30 p.m., the execution began. Reginald Brooks was strapped to a gurney in the execution chamber. His ex-wife, Beverly Brooks, was present as a witness. She sat behind a glass window about 10 feet away from him. She wore a white t-shirt with a portrait of her 3 sons on it. 2 of her sisters and a family friend were also there with her. They all wore the same shirts. When Brooks was asked if he had any final words, he said nothing. Instead, he raised both of his hands. He extended the middle fingers of both hands toward the witness area. This was a deliberate gesture to show contempt. He held his middle fingers up for the entire duration of the execution. The lethal injection was administered. It took about 20 minutes for the drugs to take effect. At 2:04 p.m., Reginald Brooks was pronounced dead. He was 66 years old. He was the oldest person executed in Ohio since 1999. After the execution, Beverly Brooks and her family spoke to reporters. Her sister Monica Stevens spoke on behalf of the family. She said they did not want to use the word closure because they had been dealing with the loss since 1982. She said their nephews were gone and would never be replaced. She said the memories and the what-ifs would always remain. She also said that something needed to be done about the long time between a murder and an execution. The family did not comment on Brooks's obscene gesture. They simply said that they had witnessed a difficult event and would not wish it on anyone. The execution of Reginald Brooks brought an end to his legal case. He had spent more than 27 years on death row before he was put to death. Throughout that time, he never admitted to the murders. He never showed remorse. His ex-wife and her family continued to mourn the 3 boys who were killed in their sleep on March 6, 1982. The case was closed, but the family carried the grief of losing Reginald Jr., Vaughn, and Niarchos for the rest of their lives. The case of Reginald Brooks ended with his execution on November 15, 2011, but the 3 young sons he murdered remained lost to their family forever. Story 2. Guadalupe Esparza was born on November 21, 1964, in San Antonio, Texas. He was Hispanic. His family lived in San Antonio for his entire childhood. His mother had mental health problems. When Esparza was about 5 or 6 years old, his mother had a mental breakdown and was put in a hospital. His father left the family and moved to another state. Because of these events, Esparza and his brothers and sisters were placed in an orphanage for some time. Later, an uncle came and brought the children back to San Antonio. When Esparza was around 10 or 11 years old, his father died. After his mother came out of the hospital, she later remarried. Esparza's stepfather would regularly beat him. The beatings were physical and happened often. Esparza grew up in a home with violence and instability. He did not have a stable or safe childhood. His family did migrant farm work, which meant they moved around frequently. Because of this, Esparza was not able to stay in one school for a long time. He moved between schools and did not have a consistent education. Esparza had difficulty learning. He was placed in special education classes at school. He had trouble with basic skills. His older sister, Esther Moncada, later said that she had difficulty teaching him how to tie his shoes and how to dress himself. She said it took longer for him to learn these skills than it did for other children. She also said that he did not play like other children and did not develop imaginary games. Esparza failed 9th grade 3 times. After failing 3 times, he dropped out of school entirely. He had about 10 years of education total. He never completed high school. When Esparza was still a teenager, he began getting into trouble with the law. In 1978, when he was about 13 years old, he was arrested for attempted arson. The charge involved throwing a Molotov cocktail at a house. He did not go to jail for this. Instead, he received what was called an informal adjustment through the Bihar County Juvenile Probation Department. This meant he was given a chance to avoid jail time by following certain rules. The next year, in 1979, Esparza was arrested again. This time he tried to steal a bicycle from a younger child. He threatened the child with a knife to get the bicycle. He was also arrested for criminal mischief, but that charge was dismissed. Around this same time, Esparza was suspended from high school. He had a reputation as a bully. One former classmate later testified that Esparza broke out the window of his family's car with a pipe and threatened to beat him up at school the next day. When Esparza was a teenager, he was accused of a serious crime against another teenager. A woman named Connie Perez later testified about something that happened when she was 13 years old. She said that Esparza strangled her and tried to sexually assault her in the woods late one night. She was able to run away and escape. This incident did not result in a conviction at the time, but it was part of a pattern of behavior that would continue. As Esparza became an adult, he worked at various jobs. He worked as a bricklayer, building houses during the day. At night, he worked part-time as a cook. He was a laborer who did physical work. In his free time, he liked to go camping and swimming. He also enjoyed cooking food at barbecues. He was not married but had a girlfriend and later had a daughter. In 1984, when Esparza was 19 years old, he was convicted of assault causing bodily injury. In this incident, he struck a man with a metal pipe and a baseball bat. This was his first adult conviction. The next year, in 1985, he committed a more serious crime. He beat a woman with a loaded gun and forced her at gunpoint to have sex with him. He was convicted of aggravated sexual assault. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for this crime. While Esparza was in prison, he continued to cause trouble. He was an active member of a prison gang. He physically attacked other inmates. In May 1989, Esparza and 3 other inmates attacked another inmate. A correctional officer later testified that the inmate would have been killed if the officers had not intervened. Esparza was not a peaceful prisoner. In July 1990, Esparza was released on parole. This happened because of a court order to relieve overcrowding in Texas prisons. He did not serve his full 12-year sentence. While he was on parole, he committed more crimes. In May 1992, he stole a car. He also conspired to steal wheels off another car. In May 1993, he pleaded guilty to possession of cocaine. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for this drug crime. He was returned to prison. In January 1996, Esparza was released on parole again. He was released on mandatory supervision, which meant he was let out early because of prison rules about overcrowding. After his release, he continued to have legal problems. In February 1998, he was cited for possessing narcotic paraphernalia. This was a misdemeanor crime. He also had to complete a mandatory sex offender treatment program because of his previous conviction. This program was required by law for registered sex offenders. By 1999, Esparza was living in San Antonio. He lived about 2 miles from an apartment complex on the west side of the city. He had a girlfriend and a 3-year-old daughter. He was 34 years old. He had a long criminal history that started in his teenage years. He had been convicted of assault, aggravated sexual assault, and drug possession. He had spent years in prison. He was a registered sex offender. He had a violent temper and a history of attacking people. He had been in prison gangs. He had a difficult childhood with an absent father, an institutionalized mother, an abusive stepfather, and a disrupted education. He had failed in school and dropped out. He had a pattern of criminal behavior that had continued for more than 20 years. About 2 months before the crime, Esparza met a woman named Diana Berlanga at a bar in San Antonio. They struck up a conversation and became friends. They saw each other socially for a few weeks. However, Diana had a friend who knew a woman named Connie Perez. Connie Perez had known Esparza when she was a teenager. Connie warned Diana to stay away from Esparza. She told Diana that Esparza was dangerous. After receiving this warning, Diana stopped taking Esparza's phone calls. She decided she did not want to see him anymore. Despite this, Esparza kept calling her. He did not stop trying to contact her. Diana Berlanga lived in an apartment on the west side of San Antonio. The address was in the 2400 block of Pin Road. She had 3 children. Her daughter was Alyssa Vasquez, who was 7 years old. Alyssa had just finished the 1st grade. Diana also had 2 sons, Joel and Aaron Vasquez. In early June 1999, Diana had recently taken in a roommate named Robin Welbrock. Robin was a babysitter who helped care for the children. On the night of June 6, 1999, Diana decided to go out for the evening. She left her 3 children at home. She left them in the care of Robin Welbrock, the babysitter and roommate. Diana went out with a friend. She was not at the apartment when the crime happened. Shortly after Diana left, Esparza arrived at the apartment. He came to the door. He was carrying 3 32-ounce cans of beer. He wanted to share the beer with Diana and Robin. He told Robin that he was looking for Diana. He asked when Diana was going to return home. Robin took 2 of the beers from him. She told Esparza to leave. She did not want him there. Esparza left the apartment, but he did not go far. He had called the apartment several times that night as well, asking for Diana. He was determined to find her. Later that night, Robin Welbrock went next door to visit a neighbor. She left the 3 children alone in the apartment. The children were asleep. While Robin was next door, Esparza came back to the apartment. He entered the home. He took Alyssa Vasquez from her bed. He took the 7-year-old girl out of the apartment. He abducted her while she was asleep and while no adult was watching. Esparza took Alyssa to a nearby location. The exact details of what happened next are known from the physical evidence. Esparza sexually assaulted the girl. He raped her. Scientific evidence later showed that he had put his sperm in her mouth. He also caused injuries to her face. Her face was swollen, scratched, and bruised. After raping her, Esparza strangled her with his hands. He used his hands to squeeze her neck until she stopped breathing. She died from the strangulation. After Alyssa was dead, Esparza took her body and left it in a nearby field. The field was behind a meat market called Culebra Meat Market. The meat market was located about 75 to 80 feet from the apartment complex where Alyssa lived. He placed her body in the tall grass. He left her there. Her body was half naked. She was naked from the waist down. Her legs were spread apart. Her face showed signs of the violence she had suffered. Robin Welbrock returned to the apartment at around 2:30 in the morning. When she came back, she noticed something was wrong. The front door of the apartment was open. The television had been turned off. Robin had left the television on before she went next door. She also found Alyssa's green shorts on the floor. Alyssa had been wearing those shorts when Robin left. Robin realized that Alyssa was not in the apartment. She started searching for the girl. While Robin was searching, she heard a noise outside. She heard the lid of a trash bin close. She looked out and saw someone running down the street. She recognized the person. It was Esparza. She saw him running away from the apartment building. This happened shortly after she discovered Alyssa was missing. Robin and others began looking for Alyssa. They eventually found her body in the tall grass behind the meat market. The discovery was made while Diana Berlanga was still out for the evening. Alyssa was found dead. She was 7 years old. She had been abducted from her own home, raped, strangled, and left in a field. The crime was brutal and quick. From the time Robin left to visit the neighbor to the time she returned, Esparza had carried out the entire crime. The sequence of events was clear. Esparza had come looking for Diana. He was angry that she was not there. He took his anger out on her young daughter. He used the opportunity when no adult was watching to enter the apartment and take the child. At the time of the crime, some people noticed things that were suspicious. Robin Welbrock saw Esparza running from the area. She knew he had been at the apartment earlier that night. She recognized him. Also, Esparza had called the apartment several times that night. These calls were recorded or noted by the phone company. He had also come to the apartment asking for Diana. These actions showed that he was present at the scene and that he had been trying to find Diana. However, at this point, no one had yet connected all the pieces together fully. The police had not yet arrested him. The investigation had not yet begun in a formal way. The body had been found, but the process of collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses had only just started. Esparza had left the scene and returned to his own residence, which was about 1.5 to 2 miles away from the apartment. He had gone home. He thought he had gotten away with the crime. After Alyssa's body was found behind the meat market, the San Antonio Police Department began their investigation. The first thing they did was talk to Robin Welbrock, the babysitter. She told them that she had seen Esparza running down the street away from the apartment. She also told them that Esparza had come to the apartment earlier that night looking for Diana and had called several times. This gave the police a clear suspect. They knew who to look for. The police went to Esparza's residence. He lived about 1.5 to 2 miles away from the apartment where Alyssa lived. They arrived at approximately 4 a.m. on the morning of June 6, 1999. They found Esparza at his home. While they were there, they searched the area outside the residence. They found a trash can. Inside the trash can, they found a shirt and a pair of boxer shorts. These items belonged to Esparza. The shirt and boxer shorts had blood spots on them. The police collected these items as evidence. They also took Esparza into custody at that time. The police then collected DNA evidence from Alyssa's body. They took an oral swab from her mouth. The swab contained spermatozoa. They also took blood samples from Alyssa and from Esparza. The forensic scientists tested the DNA. The results showed that the DNA from the sperm found in Alyssa's mouth matched Esparza's DNA. The DNA tests were conclusive. Esparza was the source of the sperm. Additionally, Alyssa's DNA was found underneath Esparza's fingernails. This showed that he had physical contact with her during the crime. While Esparza was in the Bexar County Jail waiting for his trial, he made statements to other people. One of these people was a detention guard named Sergeant Edward Gonzalez. In December 1999, Esparza filled out a request form. He asked to be placed in isolation for his own safety. Sergeant Gonzalez interviewed him about this request. During the interview, Esparza told the sergeant that he needed protection because he had killed a Mexican mafia family member. This was an admission that he had killed someone. The sergeant did not ask him about the crime. Esparza said this on his own. Esparza also talked to another inmate named Ernest Rodriguez. Rodriguez was in jail on a cocaine charge and a parole violation. He shared a housing area with Esparza. Esparza told Rodriguez that he had committed the murder. He admitted his involvement. Rodriguez then told his wife to contact the district attorney's office with this information. Rodriguez later gave 2 statements to investigators about what Esparza had told him. In exchange for his testimony, the state agreed to drop Rodriguez's cocaine possession charge. He was released from jail after that. The case went to trial in March 2001. The trial was held in the 175th District Court of Bexar County. The judge was Mary Roman. The prosecution presented their evidence. They showed the jury the DNA test results that matched Esparza to the sperm found in Alyssa's mouth. They showed the blood-spotted shirt and boxer shorts that were found in the trash can. They presented the testimony of Robin Welbrock, who saw Esparza running from the apartment. They presented Sergeant Gonzalez, who testified that Esparza admitted to killing a family member. They presented Ernest Rodriguez, who testified that Esparza confessed to him in jail. The prosecution also showed that the blood on Esparza's clothing was tested and found to be his own blood, not Alyssa's. However, Rodriguez testified that Esparza told him he threw away the clothes because he did not want investigators to think the blood came from Alyssa. This showed that Esparza knew about the crime and tried to hide evidence. Esparza decided to testify in his own defense. His lawyers advised him not to do this, but he insisted. He took the witness stand. He denied committing the crime. He said that he had gone to the apartment looking for Diana, but left when she was not there. He said he went to a bar called Barton's Boozery about a mile away. He claimed that while at the bar, he got into a fight and cut his hand on a bottle. He said he left the bar at 2 a.m. and walked home. He said he threw away his clothes because they had his own blood on them from the cut. He claimed that he was being targeted because he was a registered sex offender who happened to live nearby and knew the victim's mother. He also claimed that the witnesses were part of a conspiracy organized by the district attorney's office. To rebut Esparza's testimony, the prosecution called a witness named Manuel Longoria. Manuel testified that about 1 or 2 weeks before Alyssa's murder, he and his 7-year-old daughter Teresa had spent the night at his brother's house. Esparza came to the house in the middle of the night, looking for a place to stay. He was allowed to sleep in the living room. Teresa testified that she woke up in the middle of the night to find Esparza touching her on her stomach underneath her shirt. She ran to her cousin's room. Esparza followed her, offered her a dollar bill, and told her to go into the bathroom with him. Teresa then ran to wake her father. Manuel confronted Esparza, and an argument and fight broke out. Esparza was made to leave the house. This testimony was presented to show that Esparza had tried to molest another 7-year-old girl just weeks before Alyssa was killed. It was used to rebut Esparza's claim that he would never harm a child. On March 6, 2001, the jury found Esparza guilty of capital murder. The charge was capital murder because the murder happened during the commission of sexual assault, kidnapping, and burglary. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved to the punishment phase. The jury heard evidence about Esparza's past criminal behavior. They also heard from a forensic psychiatrist, Dr. Arambula, who had evaluated Esparza. Dr. Arambula testified that Esparza was not mentally retarded and had normal intelligence. The jury then answered the special issues required by Texas law. They found that there was a probability that Esparza would commit future acts of violence. They also found that there were not sufficient mitigating circumstances to warrant a life sentence instead of death. On March 15, 2001, the judge sentenced Esparza to death. After the trial, Esparza filed appeals. His direct appeal went to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. In June 2003, that court affirmed his conviction and sentence. He then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In November 2003, the Supreme Court denied his petition for review. He filed state habeas corpus applications, but they were denied. He filed a federal habeas petition in 2007. The federal district court denied it in March 2010. He then appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. In November 2010, the Fifth Circuit denied his request for a certificate of appealability. He again appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In May 2011, the Supreme Court denied his petition once more. During his appeals, Esparza claimed that he was mentally retarded and therefore could not be executed under the Supreme Court's decision in Atkins v. Virginia. However, the courts reviewed the evidence and found that he was not mentally retarded. The evidence showed that he had IQ scores of 86 and 88 in the past, which are above the range for mental retardation. The courts also found that his later low scores were invalid because he was not motivated to perform well on the tests. In August 2011, the trial court set Esparza's execution date for November 16, 2011. In the weeks before the execution, Esparza's lawyers asked for new DNA testing. A judge authorized the review. The new DNA tests were completed in November 2011. The results were the same as in 2001. Esparza's DNA was confirmed as matching the sperm found in Alyssa's mouth. On November 14, 2011, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles denied Esparza's request for clemency. No late legal maneuvers stopped the execution. On November 16, 2011, at 6 p.m., Esparza was taken to the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. He was 46 years old. He had been on death row for over 10 years. Diana Berlanga, Alyssa's mother, attended the execution. Other family members were also present. 2 of Esparza's friends attended. 3 of his siblings were on his witness list, but they did not show up. Esparza gave his last words. He said, "To the family of Alyssa Vasquez, I hope you will find peace in your heart. My sympathy goes out to you. I hope you find it in your heart to forgive me. I don't know why all of this happened." He also asked his friends to say goodbye to his family. He then received the lethal injection. The drugs were administered. At 6:21 p.m., 11 minutes after the injection began, Guadalupe Esparza was pronounced dead. The justice system had completed its process. The family of Alyssa Vasquez had witnessed the execution of the man who had abducted, raped, and murdered their 7-year-old girl, and his death brought a final end to the case. Story 3. Paul Ezra Rhodes was born on January 18, 1957, in Idaho Falls, Idaho. He was a white male with brown hair and hazel eyes. He was the first child in his family. He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters. His family lived in the Idaho Falls area for most of his childhood. Paul grew up in a family that had many problems. His father had a difficult life. Paul's father was physically abused when he was a child. Paul's father also had problems with alcohol and had thoughts of suicide before he married Paul's mother. Paul's extended family had many issues as well. There was a lot of alcoholism and drug addiction among his relatives. Some family members had been in institutions. Some had below-average intelligence. Several family members had committed suicide. Paul grew up surrounded by these problems. When Paul was about 4 years old, he got polio. Polio is a disease that can cause problems with movement and strength. Because of this illness, Paul had to spend a lot of time in the hospital. He had many operations on his feet. These operations caused him a lot of pain. The polio left Paul with balance problems and poor coordination. He was not able to walk or move as easily as other children. Later in his life, when Paul tried to join the military, he was rejected because of the physical problems caused by his childhood polio. Paul went to school in Idaho Falls. He liked grade school, but when he reached junior high and high school, he lost interest. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade. He did not finish high school. Paul's family had a bad reputation in the community. People in town looked down on the Rhodes family. Paul sometimes had to get into fights just because of his family name. This made his childhood and teenage years more difficult. Even though Paul had these struggles, some people who knew him said he was a gentle person. He was trusted by women who knew him. Children liked him. He often babysat his nieces and nephews, and was seen as a father figure to neighborhood children. When Paul was 16 years old, he went to work. He worked with his uncle and his father in the drywall construction business. Drywall is the material used to build walls inside houses. Paul became very skilled at this work. People who knew him said he was an excellent craftsman. He was good at his job, but while working, Paul had an industrial accident. The tips of his fingers were cut off. After his fingers healed, he continued working in construction with his family. He worked alongside his father, his uncle, and later his brother. Paul was considered a responsible and trustworthy worker by his employers. Paul had a serious problem with alcohol and drugs. He started drinking at a very young age. By the time he was 10 years old, he was already drinking alcohol. As he got older, his drug use became worse. He used many different kinds of drugs. He developed a serious addiction to methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a dangerous and powerful drug. Paul used drugs and alcohol heavily for about 19 years. His family knew he used drugs, but they may not have known how serious the problem really was. Paul's drug addiction affected his behavior and his judgment. Paul had a close relationship with his mother and father. Even as an adult, he lived with his parents until he was arrested. His mother described him as responsible and easygoing. She said he was a non-violent person who did not hold grudges. She said he never went out looking for trouble. Paul's aunts and female friends also described him as a compassionate person. They said he was trustworthy and responsible. One friend said Paul was like a big brother to her. She said she felt comfortable around him. But there were also troubling things in Paul's background. There were reports of unhealthy sexual behaviors in his family. One of his sisters told another sister that she had been sexually active with Paul for years. Paul also entered into a sexual relationship with his aunt after his uncle committed suicide. These facts show that Paul's family had serious problems with normal sexual and interpersonal relationships. Paul had a criminal record as a young man. He was first arrested at age 21 in May 1978 for refusal to disperse. Refusal to disperse means he did not leave an area when police told him to. 6 months later, he was charged with grand theft. That charge was dismissed before trial. In March 1982, he was charged again with refusal to disperse. In June 1982, he was booked for petty theft. Petty theft is stealing something of small value. In June 1985, he was arrested for driving without a license. He was arrested again for the same thing in March 1986. Some more serious charges of burglary were dismissed in January 1986. Burglary means breaking into a building to commit a crime. Paul had been lucky so far. He had been arrested several times, but most of his charges were dismissed or were for minor offenses. But his behavior was getting worse. By the time Paul was 30 years old, he had a pattern of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and minor crimes. He had dropped out of school. He had a skilled trade, but his addiction was taking over his life. People who knew him said he was gentle and trustworthy. But there were also troubling aspects to his family background and his personal relationships. Paul's life was heading in a dangerous direction. The combination of his addiction, his family problems, and his criminal behavior was creating a situation that would lead to much more serious trouble. Paul's life had been moving in a dangerous direction for many years. By the winter of 1987, his drug addiction and his criminal behavior had become much worse. During this time, Paul started loitering around convenience stores in the Blackfoot and Idaho Falls area. He would watch the female employees who worked there. He was looking for victims. He was planning something terrible. The first crime happened on February 27, 1987. Stacy Dawn Baldwin was 21 years old. She was a newlywed. She had married her husband Myron on August 1, 1986. They had known each other since high school. Stacy was athletic and physically fit. She was active in her church. She worked as a night clerk at the Red Mini Barn convenience store in Blackfoot, Idaho. Stacy began her night shift around 9:45 p.m. on February 27th. Her co-worker Stephanie Cooper worked with her until 11 p.m. After Stephanie left, Stacy was alone in the store. Around midnight, some customers rented videos from the store. One of these customers was Carrie Bayer. When Bayer left the store, she noticed a man leaving as well. The man got into a pickup truck. This truck was one that Paul's family used. The truck drove recklessly toward Bayer. Bayer saw a passenger next to the driver, but she could not identify either person. Bayer went back into the store, but could not find Stacy. Stacy's coat was still there. Her car was still outside. The last recorded transaction at the store was at 12:15 a.m. The cash register was missing $249. Paul and another man were seen having coffee at a nearby restaurant between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. that night. Paul had taken Stacy from the store at gunpoint. He forced her into his pickup truck. He drove her to a secluded spot near the Snake River, off Rose Road in Bingham County. It was a remote area near an archery range. Paul intended to sexually assault her. Stacy fought back against him. She tried to escape. Paul shot at her with his pistol. The first shots missed her. They made marks in the snow. Then he shot her while she was on her hands and knees trying to get away. One bullet hit her in the elbow. Another bullet went through her back and into her lungs. Paul left her there in the snow. She was still alive when he left. She stayed alive for about 1 hour to 1.5 hours. Then she died alone in the cold. Stacy's body was found later that morning near some garbage dumpsters on the isolated road. The footprints in the snow near her body would later be matched to Paul's boots. A hair found on her blouse was also consistent with Paul's hair. Paul had taken Stacy's digital wristwatch. He kept it in his pocket. The second crime happened on March 16, 1987. Nolan Haddon was 20 years old. He was a student at a technical vocational school. He had long blonde hair. Nolan worked the night shift at Buck's convenience store in Idaho Falls, Idaho. On the night of March 16th, Nolan was working alone. On the morning of March 17th, the owner of the store came to open it. The owner found Nolan lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Nolan had been shot 5 times. He was still alive at that time, but he was unconscious. He was taken to the hospital. He died there a few hours later. The store had been robbed. Some BC lighters, Marlboro cigarettes, and $116 in cash were missing from the store. Paul had come into the store. He shot Nolan multiple times. He left Nolan for dead in the walk-in cooler. The gun Paul used was the same gun he had used to kill Stacy Baldwin. Paul may have mistaken Nolan for a young woman because of his long blonde hair. But whether Paul knew Nolan was a man or not, he still shot him and left him to die. The third crime happened on March 19, 1987. Susan Mitchell Baker was 34 years old. She was a special education teacher at Eagle Rock Junior High in Idaho Falls. She was married to her husband Bert. They had a 2.5-year-old son named Christopher. Susan was active in her church. She was involved in sports and community affairs. On the morning of March 19th, Susan left her home to go to school. She planned to make lesson plans for a substitute teacher. She also planned to come home because she was not feeling well. She arrived at school around 6:30 a.m., but she did not come home. Around 7:30 a.m., a van that looked like Susan's van was seen in a parking lot. Paul was a passenger in that van. The van nearly collided with another car. Then it drove toward the First Interstate Bank. When the bank opened at 8:30 a.m., Susan cashed a check for $1,000 at the drive-in window. A few minutes later, she cashed another check for $1,000 at another bank branch. Paul had forced Susan to withdraw this money. He was taking her money. Around 10 a.m., a woman named Susan Browning saw Susan's van enter her driveway. Then the van backed out and left. Browning saw that Paul was the driver. Other people saw Paul in the van later that day. Paul had abducted Susan from a parking lot around 7 a.m. He forced her into her own van. He drove her to a remote, rural area. He raped her there. Then he shot her 9 times. The first shot hit her in the leg and broke her leg bone. After she was lying on the ground, he shot her 8 more times. He stood over her and shot her as she lay there. He turned her over and shot her in the middle of her chest at close range. After he shot her, he continued the sexual assault. He inserted his penis into her mouth and ejaculated. This happened while she was either almost dead or already dead. Susan's body was found on March 21st in the remote area. Paul had also taken a large amount of cash from Susan. He used some of this money to gamble. After these 3 murders, Paul fled the area. He took his mother's green Ford Ltd. His mother reported the car stolen on March 22nd or March 23rd. Paul was seen driving a similar car on March 22nd. On March 24th, truckers saw the green Ford Ltd. parked on a highway median in northern Nevada. They saw a person matching Paul's description lean out of the car and fumble with a dark brown item. The person ran off into the sagebrush. A Nevada state trooper responded to the scene. The trooper found a .38 caliber gun on the ground near the open door of the car. A holster was found about 45 feet away. That gun was the same weapon that had fired the bullets that killed Stacy Baldwin, Nolan Haddon, and Susan Mitchell Baker. Paul had abandoned the car and the weapon. He walked to a nearby ranch. He arrived at the ranch around 11 o'clock in the morning on March 25th. Later that day, he got a ride from the ranch to Wells, Nevada. He was dropped off at a casino called the Four-Way Casino around 9 p.m. He went inside to gamble with the money he had taken from his victims. At the time of these events, some people had noticed things that were wrong. Customers had seen a man leaving the mini barn when Stacy disappeared. The store owner found Nolan's body in the cooler. Susan's family reported her missing. But the police had not yet connected all of these crimes to one person. Paul had committed 3 brutal murders in 3 weeks. He had robbed his victims. He had abducted them. He had sexually assaulted them. He had left them to die or shot them repeatedly. Then he fled to Nevada with the money he had stolen. The gun he used was found near the abandoned car. Paul was now in a casino in Nevada. He did not know that the police were about to close in on him. On the night of March 25th, 1987, Paul Ezra Rhodes was sitting at a blackjack table in the Four-Way Casino in Wells, Nevada. He was gambling with the money he had taken from his victims. Nevada law enforcement officers came into the casino and arrested him. They handcuffed him and placed him over the trunk of a police car. They read him his Miranda rights, which inform a suspect of their right to remain silent and their right to an attorney. At that moment, Idaho officers arrived at the scene. They had been alerted because the green Ford Ltd. Had been found abandoned on the highway median. They had also obtained a warrant for Paul's arrest for an unrelated burglary. As the Idaho officers approached him, Paul made a spontaneous statement. Without being questioned, he said, "I did it." An Idaho officer named Victor Rodriguez then read Paul his Miranda rights again. Paul indicated that he understood these rights. During the booking process at the Wells Highway Patrol Station, another Idaho officer named Dennis Shaw made a remark to Paul. Shaw said something like, "If I had arrested you earlier, Stacy Baldwin might still be alive." In response, Paul said, "I did it." Shaw then mentioned the girl in Blackfoot, and Paul again replied, "I did it." These statements would later be used as evidence against him. When Shaw searched Paul's pockets, he found a digital wristwatch. The watch was just like the one Stacy Baldwin had been wearing on the night she was killed. Paul claimed he had found it in a ditch, but the watch was evidence that linked him to the crime. The most important piece of physical evidence was the gun. The .38 caliber revolver that was found on the ground near the abandoned Ford Ltd. Was sent to a ballistics lab for testing. Ballistics is the science of matching bullets to the guns that fired them. The testing showed that this gun had fired the bullets that killed Stacy Baldwin. The same gun had also fired the bullets that killed Nolan Haddon and Susan Mitchell Baker. This single piece of evidence connected Paul to all 3 murders. In addition, footprints found in the snow near Stacy's body were matched to the size and pattern of Paul's boots. A hair found on Stacy's blouse was consistent with Paul's hair. A jailhouse informant named David Holm later testified that Paul had admitted to him that he had kidnapped Stacy, tried to rape her, and shot her twice in the back. Paul was charged with multiple crimes. He was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Stacy Baldwin. He was charged with the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Susan Mitchell Baker. He was also charged with the robbery and murder of Nolan Haddon. The trials were held separately. For the murder of Susan Mitchell Baker, Paul was tried first. The trial took place in Bonneville County. The jury heard all of the evidence, including the ballistics match, the statements Paul made at the time of his arrest, and the testimony about the rape and shooting. On January 26, 1988, the jury found Paul guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. A separate sentencing hearing was held. Under Idaho law, the judge, not the jury, decides the sentence in capital cases. The judge found several aggravating circumstances. These are factors that make the crime worse and justify the death penalty. The judge found that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. He found that Paul had shown a propensity to commit murder and would be a continuing threat to society. The judge weighed the aggravating factors against the mitigating factors, which included Paul's difficult childhood, his polio, his drug addiction, and his positive character traits as described by his family. On March 24, 1988, the judge sentenced Paul to death for the murder of Susan Mitchell Baker. He also received a fixed life sentence for the kidnapping. For the murder of Stacy Baldwin, Paul was tried in Bingham County. The trial began in early 1988. The evidence was similar. The jury heard about the ballistics match, the footprints, the hair sample, and Paul's admissions. The jury also heard testimony from customers who had seen a man leaving the mini barn on the night Stacy disappeared. On March 11, 1988, the jury found Paul guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree kidnapping. Again, a sentencing hearing was held before the judge. The judge found multiple aggravating circumstances. These included that the murder was especially heinous and that Paul had a prior conviction for another murder. On May 13, 1988, the judge sentenced Paul to death for the murder of Stacy Baldwin and the kidnapping of Stacy Baldwin. Paul was now facing 2 death sentences. For the murder of Nolan Haddon, the case was handled differently. Paul entered a plea agreement with the prosecution. He entered an Alford plea. This is a type of plea where a defendant maintains that they are innocent, but they admit that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict them. Paul entered this plea for the murder and robbery of Nolan Haddon. As a result, he did not go to trial for this crime. Instead, on May 24, 1988, he was sentenced to 2 indeterminate life sentences. These sentences would run at the same time as his other sentences. Paul was now on death row for 2 murders and serving life for the 3rd. After his convictions and sentences, Paul began a long series of appeals. This is a legal process where a convicted person asks higher courts to review their case. Paul's lawyers argued many issues. They argued that the insanity defense had been unfairly abolished in Idaho. They argued that his statements to police should have been suppressed because his Miranda rights were violated. They argued that the prosecution had withheld exculpatory evidence, such as the confession of another man named Kevin Buchholz to the Baldwin murder. They argued that the jury instructions on reasonable doubt were confusing and unconstitutional. They argued that the victim impact statements had unfairly influenced the judge. The Idaho Supreme Court reviewed all of these claims. In 1991, the Idaho Supreme Court affirmed Paul's convictions and sentences. The court found that the errors, if any, were harmless and did not change the outcome of the trials. The United States Supreme Court declined to review the case. Paul then filed federal habeas corpus petitions. Habeas corpus is a legal action where a prisoner asks a federal court to review their state conviction on constitutional grounds. These petitions were filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Idaho. The District Court reviewed Paul's claims and denied them. Paul appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Over many years, the Ninth Circuit denied his appeals. In 2010 and 2011, the Ninth Circuit issued opinions affirming the denial of relief. Paul's lawyers also filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court. On October 11, 2011, the Supreme Court declined to hear his case. Paul also asked the Idaho Commission of Pardons and Parole for a commutation hearing. A commutation hearing would have allowed him to ask for his death sentence to be reduced to life in prison. On November 4, 2011, the commission denied this request. Paul also challenged Idaho's new lethal injection protocol. He argued that the procedure would cause him cruel and unusual punishment. On November 15, 2011, his lawyers filed an emergency appeal with the Ninth Circuit. On November 16, 2011, the Ninth Circuit denied the stay of execution. On November 17, 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court also denied a last-minute request to stop the execution. All of his legal options had been exhausted. Paul's execution was scheduled for the morning of November 18, 2011, at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution south of Boise. This would be Idaho's first execution since 1994. It was only the second execution carried out involuntarily in the state since 1957. In his final days, Paul was allowed to have visits from his family. He watched television, read, and did artwork. He was talkative with his family and his attorney. The night before the execution, Paul was offered a special meal. The meal included hot dogs, sauerkraut, mustard, ketchup, onions, relish, baked beans, veggie sticks, ranch dressing, fruit with gelatin, and strawberry ice cream cups. This was the same meal offered to all inmates at the prison that night. Paul also received a card signed by all but one of the other death row inmates. On the morning of November 18, 2011, the execution process began. There was a short delay because a last-minute motion for a stay was filed at 3 a.m. An Ada County District Judge denied the stay at about 8 a.m. The execution was rescheduled to begin at 9:05 a.m. Paul was moved from his isolation cell to the execution chamber. He was strapped to a table on his back. Witnesses were escorted into the chamber. Among the witnesses were representatives from the families of all three victims. Paul's mother was also in attendance. For members of the Idaho media witnessed the execution on behalf of the public. Paul seemed nervous and antsy. He occasionally tapped his hand on the table. The warden read the death warrant to Paul. Then the warden asked Paul if he wished to make a final statement. Paul spoke in a clear, loud voice. He directed his words to the victims' families. He said, "To Burt Mitchell Baker, I am sorry for the part one played in your wife's death." He did not take responsibility for the other two murders. He said, "For Haddon and Baldwin, I can't help you. You still have to keep looking. I'm sorry for your family. I can't help you. I took part in the Mitchell Baker murder. I can't help you guys. I'm sorry." Then Paul turned to his mother and said, "Mom, goodbye." Finally, he turned to the warden and the executioners and said, "I forgive you, I really do." After his statement ended, the administration of the lethal injection drugs began. The process took about 22 minutes. At 9:15 a.m., Paul Ezra Rhodes was pronounced dead. After the execution, the victims' families spoke to the media. Julie Haddon, the mother of Nolan Haddon, said she felt relieved. She said she was glad that the ordeal was over and that she would not have to hear about Paul Rhodes anymore. She said that what bothered her was that Paul said he could not help the Haddon and Baldwin families because he did not commit those murders. She called him a coward. Stacy Baldwin's brother quietly said, "He lied the whole way through." A family friend of the Mitchell Bakers said he felt relief and a sense of peace. He said the execution brought some closure, though the pain of losing Susan would never fully heal. The lead prosecutor who had handled the Baldwin case said that nothing could bring the victims' loved ones back, but the execution brought some satisfaction and closure. He said the case was finally closed. Paul's body was cremated after the execution. His remains were given to his attorney. The case of Paul Ezra Rhodes, which had begun with 3 brutal murders in 1987 and continued through more than 2 decades of legal battles, had finally reached its permanent and irreversible end. Story 4. Gary Roland Welch was born on August 21, 1962, in the United States. He was a white male with brown hair and blue eyes. As an adult, he would grow to be 6 feet tall and weigh about 210 pounds. But before he became that man, he was a child who grew up in a very troubled home. Welch's childhood was marked by hardship and neglect. His family did not provide a safe or stable environment. Reports from social workers and juvenile authorities show that he suffered from emotional and physical abuse at a young age. In one documented instance, his parents actually chained him up as a form of punishment or control. This was not a normal way to discipline a child. Being chained caused him physical pain and emotional fear. It also left him with deep psychological scars that would follow him into his teenage years and beyond. Because of the abuse and instability at home, Welch had serious behavioral problems as a child and as a teenager. He got into trouble with the law early in his life. The authorities documented his problems in juvenile records. He did not follow rules and often acted out in violent or aggressive ways. His family also had a history of mental illness, which added to the difficulties he faced. Growing up, he did not learn how to handle his emotions or how to get along with others in a normal, peaceful way. As a young adult, Welch continued to struggle. He turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with his painful past. He became a regular user of methamphetamine, a dangerous and addictive drug. The drug use made his behavior worse. It affected his thinking and made him more aggressive and unpredictable. He also worked as a tattoo artist, which was a skill he had learned. But his work did not keep him out of trouble. His life was marked by a pattern of conflict, anger, and run-ins with the law. Welch's criminal record started early and grew over time. He committed multiple violent offenses. He was convicted of assaulting women. He also assaulted police officers. He was involved in burglaries. He carried concealed weapons illegally. He had stabbings on his record. These were not just small mistakes. They showed that he had a lasting problem with violence. He did not respect the law or the safety of other people. In 1981, he was convicted of aggravated assault and battery upon a police officer. That meant he had attacked a police officer who was doing his job. The conviction was for a felony, which is a serious crime. In 1982, he was convicted again. This time it was for assault and battery with a dangerous weapon after a former felony conviction. That meant he had used a weapon to hurt someone, and he had already been convicted of a felony before, so the punishment was more severe. In 1986, he faced more legal trouble. He was convicted on 2 counts of assault and battery with a deadly weapon in Ottawa County, Oklahoma, under case number 82-234. He received a sentence of 5 years and 1 year of probation. His probation was set to run from December 20th, 1990 until December 19th, 1993. But even while on probation, he did not change his ways. At one point, Welch was sent to the reformatory at Granite, Oklahoma. This was a prison facility for younger offenders. He spent time there serving a 21-month sentence. He was released from Granite in March of 1988. He had spent only the last 90 days of that sentence at Granite, which suggests he was moved there from somewhere else. But prison did not teach him how to live peacefully. When he got out, he went back to his old habits. Welch had a series of troubled relationships with women. He was married, and he also had girlfriends. But he was not a good partner. He was abusive. Multiple women reported that he physically assaulted them. In one incident, he broke down a door, hit a woman, and threw her against a Christmas tree. In another incident, he went to his girlfriend's home and demanded sex. When she refused, he beat her in front of her 2 young children. He told the children to lie down and be quiet or he would kill them. He then tore her clothes off and put her head through a cabinet and a wall. Another time, his girlfriend believed he was going to kill her, so she fired a shotgun at him. She missed. He took the gun, bent it, and hit her in the head with it. These were not isolated events. In another attack, he found his girlfriend in her yard and dragged her inside her home. He stuck her head in a washing machine, threw her down on a coffee table, and held a knife to her throat. The violence was repeated and escalating. Less than 1 month before the major crime he would later commit, his wife requested a protective order against him. She said he had hit her, injuring her mouth and blackening her eye. He then forced her to take him to his girlfriend's house. The next day, he and his girlfriend returned to his wife's home and took a television, a VCR, and a cable box. They destroyed a window and an air conditioner. The girlfriend left a threatening note. This shows that Welch's pattern of violence was constant and that he was not able to control his anger, even with the people who were closest to him. Despite his criminal past, Welch did have some family connections. His mother was still alive and cared about him. However, her testimony later showed that she was not very coherent and had difficulty explaining things clearly. She talked about social workers coming to their house and seemed confused about their intentions. This suggests that the family environment was chaotic from the very beginning. Welch also had a friend who testified later that Welch was a good person when he was not drinking or taking drugs. This shows that his drug and alcohol use was a major trigger for his violent behavior. Without the substances, he could be calm and friendly, but with them, he became dangerous. Welch's mental health was also a factor. A licensed clinical psychologist who evaluated him later found that his mental capacity was impaired. This was caused by a combination of his long-term substance abuse and the trauma he experienced in childhood. The psychologist said that Welch's condition could be controlled with medication and by removing drugs and alcohol. He also said that Welch benefited from a controlled environment, like the structure found in a prison. This meant that Welch needed external limits to keep his behavior in check. On his own, in the outside world, he could not manage his impulses. By the early 1990s, Welch was living in Miami, Oklahoma, which is a small city in the northeastern part of the state. He was in his early 30s. He had a long history of arrests and convictions. He had abused drugs for years. He had hurt many people, including women, police officers, and strangers. He had been in prison and on probation. His childhood had been abusive and chaotic. His adult life had been a continuation of that chaos. He had not found a way to break the cycle. He was still using methamphetamine. He was still carrying weapons. He was still getting into fights and threatening people. On the surface, Welch was a man with a job as a tattoo artist and a few friends who liked him when he was sober. But underneath that, he was a man with a violent temper, a long criminal record, a drug addiction, and a history of mental health problems that had never been properly treated. All of these factors were present in his life. They were the background that led to everything that would happen next. On August 25, 1994, Gary Roland Welch was 32 years old. He was living in or near Miami, Oklahoma, a small city in the northeastern part of the state. On that day, he was with a companion named Claudie Delbert Conover. Conover was also a white male. The two men were together in a car. The day started with Welch looking for drugs. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Welch and Conover drove to the home of a man named Johnny Rogers. Rogers had a brother-in-law named Stephen St. John, who was present at the house that day. St. John saw Rogers walk out to Welch's car. He heard Welch ask Rogers for a bump, which was a slang term for an injection of drugs. Rogers told Welch that he did not have any drugs to give him. Welch did not accept this answer. He got out of the car. He was carrying a knife. He pointed the knife at Rogers and demanded, "Give me a goddamned bump." Then he turned the knife on St. John and told him to look the other way. St. John was frightened and did as he was told. Welch continued to demand drugs in an aggressive and threatening manner. This continued until Conover patted Welch on the back and told him to leave. Conover said, "Let's get out of here." Welch listened to Conover and got back in the car. The two men drove away from Roger's home. About 1 hour later, the two men drove to a different location. They went to a duplex on a street in Miami. A duplex is a building that has two separate homes, one on each side. One side of the duplex was occupied by a man named Larry Davis and his wife. The other side of the duplex was occupied by the victim, Robert Dean Hardcastle. Hardcastle was 35 years old. He was a white male. He had twin sons who were 2 years old at the time. When Welch and Conover arrived, Conover got out of the car and went to Larry Davis's side of the duplex. Davis knew Conover and invited him inside. Davis was cooking dinner. He noticed that there was a car parked toward the back of the duplex, but he only saw Conover at that moment. He did not see Welch at first. Inside Davis's home, Conover sat down and talked with Davis. At some point, Davis went into the kitchen to help with the cooking. While he was in the kitchen, he heard banging noises coming from Hardcastle's side of the duplex. The noises sounded like a fight or a struggle. Davis returned to the living room and made a comment to Conover. He said he wondered if Hardcastle was winning his wrestling match. Conover replied in a joking tone. He said, "I wouldn't worry about it. Somebody's probably getting a spanking over a deal." This statement from Conover was important. It showed that Conover knew something was happening next door. He seemed to know that the banging was related to a deal or a dispute. But at that moment, neither Davis nor Conover went to check on Hardcastle. A few minutes later, Davis heard his living room window break. He turned and saw Hardcastle running past his window. Hardcastle was yelling, "I don't have any," or "I didn't do it." He was clearly in distress. He ran onto Davis's porch. Davis could see that Hardcastle had blood on his hands, his forearms, his face, and his bare chest. He was wounded and terrified. Both Conover and Davis moved toward the door of the duplex. Conover went out first. Davis followed, but when he saw Conover go outside, he became scared for his wife, who was also in the home. Davis shut the door and stayed inside with his wife. He did not go out to help Hardcastle. At this point, Hardcastle was running away from his own home. He ran across the street. He was trying to escape from someone. That someone was Gary Welch. Welch had been inside Hardcastle's home, and the two men had fought. Later, Welch would claim that Hardcastle attacked him first with his own knife. But the physical evidence and the witnesses would tell a different story. Welch chased Hardcastle out of the duplex and across the street. Conover also came out of Davis's home and joined the chase. The two men ran after Hardcastle. Hardcastle was trying to get away, but he could not outrun them. At that same time, a married couple named Donnie and Patricia Nading were driving their children to football practice. They were on the same street. Patricia Nading noticed a commotion at the side of the road. They saw 3 men run across the street in front of their car. The Nadings pulled their vehicle over to get a better view. What they saw was horrifying. Hardcastle was crouched in a fetal position in a ditch at the end of the street. He was trying to protect himself. Conover was standing over him and punching him. Welch was also there, and he was stabbing Hardcastle with a knife. The 2 men were beating and stabbing Hardcastle while he was on the ground, unable to defend himself. The Nadings pulled up to the next house. Donnie Nading used the neighbor's telephone to call the police. While he was on the phone, he stood by a window that had an unobstructed view of the ditch. He continued to watch the attack. He saw the 2 men continue to beat Hardcastle. Another car drove by and stopped near the scene. Conover left the victim and walked over to that car. He banged on the back window and screamed profanities at the driver. He told the driver to leave. The driver was frightened and drove away. While Conover was yelling at the first driver, Welch did not stop the attack. Instead, he moved away from Hardcastle for a moment. He walked 5 to 7 feet away from the ditch to retrieve a broken beer bottle that was lying on the ground. He smashed the bottle on something to make it sharp. Then he returned to Hardcastle and used the broken bottle to slash and stab him repeatedly. Welch continued to cut Hardcastle's body with the broken glass. Conover finished yelling at the first car. Then a second car pulled up, driven by a woman named Rochelle Campbell. She saw Conover run toward a nearby house. She saw a car pull out from the area and stop to pick up Welch. Conover was driving that car. He drove the car toward Campbell at a high speed. She had to back her car into a ditch to avoid being hit. As the car drove past her, Conover yelled profanities and told her to get out of the way. The two men drove away from the scene. They left Hardcastle lying in the ditch. He was covered in blood and severely wounded. The first police officer to arrive at the scene was Officer Jim Gamble. He knew Hardcastle from childhood. When he arrived, Hardcastle was still alive, but barely. Hardcastle looked at Officer Gamble and said, "Jim, Gary Welch did this shit to me." He clearly identified Welch as his attacker. He then asked for water and collapsed. Gamble radioed for an ambulance and told the paramedics to hurry. He also radioed in Welch's name as a suspect. Hardcastle died a few minutes later. The cause of death was bleeding to death from multiple stab wounds. Later, a medical examiner performed an autopsy on Hardcastle's body. The autopsy report showed that Hardcastle had received at least 10 stab wounds. 3 of those wounds penetrated his lungs, which was fatal. In addition to the stab wounds, he had numerous incision wounds. Incision wounds are cuts or slashes that are wider than they are deep. These superficial wounds were consistent with the cuts made by a broken beer bottle. Some of the stab wounds were also consistent with the broken knife that was later found. The combination of the knife and the broken bottle showed that Welch used both weapons to kill Hardcastle. While Welch and Conover were making their escape, a police officer spotted their car. The car and the 2 men inside matched the descriptions that had been given over the police radio. The officer was in an unmarked car, so he did not try to stop them immediately. He called for a marked police car to back him up and followed the suspects. When the backup arrived, the officers pulled the car over and arrested both Welch and Conover. As the car was being stopped, one of the men threw a broken knife out of the vehicle. The officers later recovered that knife. When the officers searched Welch at the booking station, they found a knife scabbard on his belt. A scabbard is a sheath that holds a knife. They also found another knife in the car. Welch had a serious wound on his left forearm. The wound went completely through his arm, meaning it had an entry and an exit wound. He refused medical treatment that night. Later, he passed out in his cell. The next day, he was taken to the hospital and underwent surgery on his arm. The police also searched Hardcastle's duplex. They found evidence that a major fight had taken place inside the home. The kitchen and the area near the front door showed signs of a violent struggle. This confirmed that the attack started inside Hardcastle's home before he ran outside. Witnesses to the attack were numerous. Larry Davis heard the banging and saw Hardcastle run past his window. Donnie and Patricia Nading watched the assault from their car and from the neighbor's house. Rochelle Campbell saw the escape. Officer Gamble heard Hardcastle's dying words. All of these witnesses would later testify about what they saw and heard. The evidence was clear. Welch and Conover had gone to Hardcastle's home. A fight broke out. Hardcastle tried to escape by running out of his home and across the street, but Welch and Conover chased him down. They caught him in a ditch. Conover held him down and punched him. Welch stabbed him with a knife and then used a broken beer bottle to slash him further. They did not stop even when other people drove by and saw them. They did not stop until Hardcastle was mortally wounded. Then they fled. Hardcastle died as a result of the attack. His body had been cut and stabbed many times. He was left to die in a ditch on the side of the road. After the arrest, Welch was charged with first-degree murder. The charge meant that the state believed he had killed Hardcastle with malice and premeditation. Conover was also charged with the same crime. They were both held in custody. Welch was taken to jail and eventually moved to the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He was now facing the possibility of the death penalty. Welch maintained that he acted in self-defense. He later said that he had gone to Hardcastle's home to talk about a tattoo. He claimed that Hardcastle had taken his knife and attacked him first. He said he was just defending himself. He denied that he had gone to Hardcastle's home looking for drugs on that day. He also denied that he had threatened Rogers and St. John earlier that afternoon. But the witnesses contradicted his story. The physical evidence also did not match his version of events. His arm wound, which he claimed was from Hardcastle's attack, could have been caused by a knife that was found in the getaway car, not the knife used in the fight. This made his self-defense claim very weak. The crime was brutal and public. It happened in broad daylight on a street where people could see it. Multiple witnesses saw the attack and identified Welch as the primary attacker. The victim, Robert Hardcastle, died from his wounds. He left behind twin sons who were only 2 years old. The investigation into Robert Hardcastle's murder began immediately after the attack. The first officer on the scene, Officer Jim Gamble, heard Hardcastle's dying words identifying Gary Welch as the attacker. Gamble radioed that information to other officers. At the same time, other officers were already responding to calls from witnesses who had seen the attack. The witnesses gave descriptions of the two men and the car they used to flee. This information was shared over the police radio. Because the witnesses had provided clear descriptions, the police were able to spot Welch and Conover's car as they were driving away. The officer who spotted them followed the car and called for backup. When backup arrived, the officers stopped the car and arrested both men. The police recovered a broken knife that had been thrown from the car. They also found a knife scabbard on Welch's belt and another knife inside the vehicle. These items were collected as evidence. The police also gathered statements from all the witnesses. Larry Davis told them what he had heard and seen from his duplex. Donnie and Patricia Nading gave detailed accounts of the attack they watched from the road. Rochelle Campbell described how the two men nearly caused a car accident as they fled. The physical evidence from the scene, including the broken beer bottle and the victim's wounds, was also documented. The medical examiner performed an autopsy and confirmed that Hardcastle died from multiple stab wounds and cuts. All of this evidence was collected and organized for the prosecution. Welch and Conover were formally charged with first-degree murder. The case went to trial. Because there were two defendants, the court granted a motion to sever their trials. This meant they would be tried separately. Conover was tried first. He was convicted and sentenced to death. However, his death sentence was later reduced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Conover never left prison. He died of natural causes on December 19, 2001, while incarcerated at the Dick Connor Correctional Center in Hominy, Oklahoma. Welch's trial took place about 10 months after Conover's trial. The trial began in the District Court of Ottawa County, Oklahoma, with Judge Sam C. Fullerton presiding. The lead prosecutor was Ben Loring. Welch was represented by Joe P. Robertson, an attorney from the Oklahoma Indigent Defense System. During the first stage of the trial, the prosecution presented the evidence. The witnesses testified one by one. They told the jury what they had seen on August 25, 1994. The prosecution also presented the physical evidence, including the knives, the broken bottle, and the autopsy photographs. Welch chose to testify in his own defense. He told the jury that he had acted in self-defense. He said he had gone to Hardcastle's home to talk about a tattoo, and that Hardcastle had attacked him first. He denied that he had been looking for drugs earlier that day. He also denied threatening Johnny Rogers and Stephen St. John. The prosecution then cross-examined Welch. They pointed out the inconsistencies in his story. They showed that the physical evidence did not match his version of events. They also reminded the jury that multiple witnesses had seen Welch stabbing and slashing Hardcastle, while Hardcastle was on the ground and unable to defend himself. The jury did not believe Welch's self-defense claim. They found him guilty of first-degree murder. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved to the second stage. This was the sentencing phase. The jury had to decide whether Welch should receive the death penalty, life in prison without parole, or life in prison with the possibility of parole. The prosecution presented evidence of 3 aggravating circumstances. These are factors that make the crime more severe and justify the death penalty. The first aggravating circumstance was that Welch had previous felony convictions involving the use or threat of violence. The prosecution showed that Welch had been convicted of aggravated assault and battery upon a police officer in 1981 and assault and battery with a dangerous weapon after a former felony conviction in 1982. The second aggravating circumstance was that there was a probability that Welch would commit future acts of violence and be a continuing threat to society. To prove this, the prosecution called police officers who testified about Welch's history of violence, including attacks on officers and incidents of domestic abuse. They also called a fellow inmate who testified that Welch had assaulted him while they were in jail together. A jailer testified that Welch enjoyed watching violent movies and got excited while watching them. The third aggravating circumstance was that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. The prosecution argued that the attack was brutal. Hardcastle was chased, beaten, stabbed, and slashed with a broken bottle while he was conscious and trying to escape. He suffered greatly before he died. In response, Welch's defense team presented evidence in mitigation. Mitigating evidence is information that might make the jury feel that the death penalty is not appropriate. They called a clinical psychologist, Dr. Philip Murphy, who testified that Welch's mental capacity was impaired by drug and alcohol abuse and childhood trauma. He said that Welch's behavior could be controlled with medication in a structured environment. They also called a friend who said Welch was a good person when he was sober. Welch's wife testified that she loved him, but she admitted that he needed an environment where he could not get drugs or alcohol. Welch's mother also testified, but her testimony was confused and difficult to follow. The defense also tried to show that Welch had a difficult childhood, but they did not present all of the available evidence about his abuse, such as the social worker reports and juvenile records. The jury also heard victim impact statements from Hardcastle's family. His brother, his father, and his mother each read statements. They described the pain and loss they had suffered. They talked about Hardcastle's twin sons, who were now growing up without a father. They told the jury about the nightmares the children had and the questions they asked. They also expressed their opinions that Welch deserved the death penalty. Some of their statements were emotional and contained strong language. They called Welch an animal and a parasite. They said he showed no remorse. During their deliberations, the jury sent 2 notes to the judge. They asked if a sentence of life without parole could ever be reduced, or if anyone had ever been released with that sentence. The judge responded to both questions by saying, "I am not allowed to answer this question." The jury continued deliberating and eventually returned with their decision. They found all 3 aggravating circumstances to be true. They determined that the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigating evidence. They recommended the death penalty. On May 30th, 1996, Judge Fullerton sentenced Gary Roland Welch to death. After the sentence, Welch began the appeals process. His conviction and death sentence were automatically appealed to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. In 1998, that court affirmed his conviction and sentence in a case called Welch v. State, 968 P.2D 1231. The court found that some errors had occurred during the trial, such as improper victim impact testimony and a comment by the prosecutor on Welch's right to remain silent. However, The court ruled that these errors were harmless and did not affect the outcome. Welch then filed for post-conviction relief, which is a request to have the conviction reviewed again based on new issues. The same court denied that request in 1998 in a case called Welch v. State, 972p.2d26. The court ruled that most of his claims were barred because they had already been raised on direct appeal, or could have been raised then. Welch then took his case to the federal courts. He filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Oklahoma. A writ of habeas corpus is a way for a prisoner to challenge the legality of their detention in federal court. The district court denied his petition in 2007. Welch appealed that decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. In 2011, the 10th Circuit upheld the denial of his habeas petition in a case called Welch v. Workman, 639F.3d980. The court reviewed all of his claims and found no reason to overturn his conviction or sentence. His appeals were exhausted. As his execution date approached, Welch made one final attempt to avoid the death penalty. He asked the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board for clemency. Clemency is a request for mercy that could reduce his sentence to life in prison. On December 5, 2011, Welch appeared before the board. He did not apologize for the murder. He remained defiant. He told the board that he was not there to cry or beg. He insisted that he had killed Hardcastle in self-defense. He said, "I did what I had to do." The board voted 3-2 to deny clemency. The decision was close, but it was not enough to save his life. After the clemency hearing, Welch attempted to take his own life. On December 16, 2011, he used a smuggled razor blade to cut his throat in his cell. Prison guards found him bleeding and rushed him to the McAllister Regional Health Center. He spent 3 days in the intensive care unit. He recovered from his injuries and was returned to death row. Prison officials and his own attorney insisted that he was sane and understood what was happening to him. He was evaluated by a psychiatric unit and deemed competent to be executed. On the day of his execution, which was January 5, 2012, Welch was moved from the infirmary to the execution holding cell. He was given his last meal. He requested 2 fish fillets from Long John Silver's, a fast food restaurant. He ate them with red cocktail sauce. He was also given the opportunity to speak with a spiritual advisor, but he chose not to. That evening, Welch was taken to the execution chamber at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAllister. The execution was scheduled for 6 o'clock in the evening. There were 7 media witnesses present. 3 members of Hardcastle's family also witnessed the execution. Welch had requested that no witnesses attend on his behalf, so no one came to support him. The warden, Randy Workman, asked Welch if he had any last words. Welch gave a short speech. He thanked the other death row inmates who were banging on their cell doors. This banging was a tradition on death row, a way for the inmates to show respect to a fellow prisoner who was about to be executed. Welch said, "I want to acknowledge that my brothers are here for me, to send me off on my journey. They are here on my behalf. They've already given me my little send-off. So let's get it on, because that's what we're here for." At 6:04 p.m., the warden said, "Let the execution begin." The lethal injection drugs were administered. As soon as the drugs began to flow into his body, Welch began to chant. He repeated the same phrase over and over. Valhalla, Odin, slay the beast. He chanted this 4 times. On the 4th chant, his voice became garbled and he lost consciousness. The chanting was related to his beliefs about Norse mythology. He had studied these beliefs in prison. He believed that after death, he would have to fight a 3-headed dragon that guarded the gates of Valhalla, a warrior's paradise. He believed that if he could slay the beast, he would be allowed to enter. At 6:10 p.m., a physician pronounced Gary Roland Welch dead. He was 49 years old. He was the first person executed in the United States in 2012. His execution was also the first in Oklahoma that year. After the execution, Hardcastle's family did not make any statements to the press. They had witnessed the execution, but they chose to remain silent. The Oklahoma Attorney General, Scott Pruitt, issued a written statement. He said that Welch had a 15-year history of violent crimes before his murder conviction. He said that the death penalty was reserved for the most heinous crimes. He offered his thoughts to Hardcastle's family, who had endured the loss for 17 years. Welch never apologized for the murder. He never showed remorse. He maintained until the very end that he had acted in self-defense. His co-defendant, Claudie Conover, had already died in prison years earlier. The case was finally over. Gary Roland Welch was executed by lethal injection on January 5, 2012, and the state of Oklahoma carried out the punishment that a jury had determined was just for the murder of Robert Dean Hardcastle.